Zion is Utah's oldest and most popular national park, hosting almost 3 million visitors a year. These numerous guests, many from outside the United States, come to experience the vibrant colors and breathtaking sceneries contained in the desert oasis of Zion. Zion offers many spectacular hikes and scenic drives. Among the favorites are the Narrows, where visitors get to stomp through water for hours while taking in the spectacular views. At times, the slot canyons become so tight, hikers can almost touch both walls at the same time. Angel's Landing is a breathtaking hike up a narrow trail and across a rock fin. The last half mile of the hike has 1,500-foot cliffs on both sides. The subway requires a full day's journey to reach a picturesque slot canyon. The subway receives its name from the rounded rock overhangs that were carved by water and encompass parts of the trail. These eroded rock walls create the appearance of an underground subway tunnel that is so perfect it could have been cut by a machine. The 1.1-mile-long Carmel Tunnel that connects the northern and southern parts of the park is a favorite drive among tourists. It was the longest tunnel ever constructed at its completion in 1930. The Kolob Arch is the second longest natural arch in the world, only 3 feet shorter than the longest at Arches National Park. Whether by foot, bicycle, or automobile, Zion National Park has something to entice the eye and spark the wonder of millions of people per year. Zion is a Hebrew word that denotes a place of sanctuary. The name was given to the area by the early Mormon pioneers that saw the presence of the Almighty in the middle of a harsh desert landscape. Zion National Park is located in southwestern Utah between the small towns of Springdale and Kanab. The park sits on the edge of the Colorado Plateau and is part of a supersequence rock formation known as the Grand Staircase. This vast slab of sedimentary rock stretches from Bryce Canyon National Park in the north, then descends 5,000 feet over 100 miles to the south before ending at the base of the Grand Canyon.
Grand Canyon's at the bottom, Zion's at the middle, Bryce is up at the top.
Over millions of years, various ecosystems, including inland seas, sand dunes, and riverbeds, left sedimentary deposits of diverse colors and thickness.
There was a big sand desert here 180 million years ago. Geologists call it the Navajo Desert. And the sand dunes that existed in the Great Navajo Desert were between 2,000 and 3,000 feet in depth. Some of the largest sand dunes the world has ever seen, right here 180 million years ago.
9 distinct layers can be seen in the park. Underground tectonic processes shifted and warped the formations, slowly creating different variations.
Well, time marches on. You got all that compression, pushing all that sand together, turning it into stone.
What we now call the Virgin River began to carve what is now Zion Canyon. And those sand dunes solidified into sandstone.
And make no mistake about it, gravity and water are literally tearing these cemented sand dunes apart.
The majestic beauty of Zion Canyon is the result of the Virgin River cutting and weaving its way through the many layers of the Grand Staircase.
The Virgin River is removing about 16 tons of rock and dirt every day out of the canyon. Now that's on average. Most of that material is moved during 10 to 15 flash flood events a year.
Zion's breathtaking sights are the work of millions of years of powerful geologic forces that continue to act today, such as a 5.8 magnitude earthquake that struck the park in 1992.
A slide came down, dammed up the Virgin River, a lake formed, and eventually so much water built up that the river cut around the landslide along the path of least resistance, which turned out to be the scenic drive. We lost about 300 feet of road in a matter of minutes, and it stranded people at Zion Lodge for about 3 days.
Despite their sturdy appearance, the beautiful rock structures of Zion are a part of a dynamic landscape that is under slow but constant change.
But there's going to be more slides. The road's probably going to be taken out again and again and again.
2 ancient groups of inhabitants occupied the lands in and around Zion Canyon before Europeans ever made it into the region. The ancient Pueblo people, known as the Anasazi, a name given to them by the Navajo meaning enemy, emerged in the southwest United States around 300 BC. Archaeological evidence shows that the Anasazi were quite sophisticated. They cultivated maize, beans, and squash, while supplementing their diet with protein sources through hunting. They lived in complex and carefully crafted structures such as pit houses, pueblos, and cliff dwellings. By 1300 AD, the Anasazi had mysteriously disappeared.
There's a transition from Anasazi, which has existed maybe 1,000 years before that, to Fremont, which is more pit houses.
Stories explaining their disappearance have been the topic of much speculation, including claims that they traveled south and became the mighty Aztec people of Mexico, to more believable theories that they assimilated into modern-day Pueblo tribes.
It's difficult to know whether one group replaces the other or intermixes and assimilates with the other.
The Fremont people lived throughout Utah and in parts of Colorado, Idaho, and Nevada. Arriving later than the Anasazi, around 700 AD, they often occupied the same regions. Due to their close proximity, these two cultures were long believed to be the same, but archaeological findings confirm distinct differences from the Anasazi. The Fremont generally lived in pit houses. They subsisted off of maize horticulture and hunting deer and small game. Younger Fremont sites in southern Utah often contain artifacts from the southern Paiute people who still remain in the region. Whether this mixing of artifacts was due to trade, conquest, or assimilation is still a current topic of debate. Like their contemporaries, the Anasazi, the Fremont suddenly vanished around 1300 AD.
Ancient sites in the Washington County area show remnants of Fremont and beginnings of Paiute side by side or sometimes in the same site, which may just mean trade, but it also may mean assimilation.
The southern Paiute have lived in the area for 1,000 years.
The southern Paiutes who were on the Virgin River were known as the Parus, and that's because they called the Virgin River Parus.
Parus can roughly be translated as White River on account of the foaming currents that are created by its fast-moving waters. The Parus band has no surviving members, as the last known Parus died in the 1940s.
Parus, the folks who lived on the Virgin River in the Zion area, basically died out or mixed in with other bands.
The Paiute survived through a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Living a nomadic life, they camped in the warmer lower elevations in the winter and cooler higher elevations in the summer. Grass seed was a staple of their diet.
But Jedediah Strong Smith, in 1826, exactly 50 years after the Dominguez Escalante expedition, did come here. He saw impressive agriculture that he hadn't seen the likes of, and maybe as many as 800 Native Americans stretched along the river.
When Mormon settlers moved into Paiute lands, the cattle they brought with them wreaked havoc on the Paiute seed supply. The Indians, being unaccustomed to the idea of personal and private property, occasionally killed the settlers' cattle for food, causing intermittent friction between Indians and white settlers.
And that was actually true in the valley here. The Indians, their main food source here was the seeds from grass. But when the pioneers came in and started grazing it, the grass has basically disappeared along with the Indians' food supply, which was one of the problems.
The Paiutes saw the Mormons as an advantage to protect them from the Utes. They saw them as a disadvantage because the Mormons, like all other Americans, believed in private property. And they came in and fenced the land, and they brought cattle. And the cattle ate the seeds that the Paiute women used to make flour.
This relationship was based on mutual needs. The Paiutes were not horsemen, and a lack of horses put them at a serious disadvantage in war against other Indian tribes. The Paiutes needed the Mormons to protect them from Ute and Navajo slave raiders who had made a habit of taking Paiutes at will. The Mormons needed to remain friendly with the Paiutes, so the federal government, who the Mormons were in constant conflict with, could not use the Indians against them. Jacob Hamblin, a Mormon missionary and pioneer, was instrumental in maintaining a peaceful Mormon-Paiute partnership. Hamblin had been sent by Mormon prophet Brigham Young as a missionary to the Indians of southern Utah. Fully believing that he had been called by God to minister to the Paiutes, he felt that he would be divinely protected as long as he always respected the Indians and spoke to them with complete honesty. His bravery was legendary, as he often intervened in tense conflicts between Indians and Mormon settlers. When negotiating between settlers and Indians, he refused to carry a weapon and often went unaccompanied. An observer to one such event remarked that no braver man ever lived. In 1858, Mormon missionary Nephi Johnson, under the direction of Brigham Young, was looking for more areas of possible settlements for the Mormons.
Nephi Johnson, who is claimed to be the first to go with Paiute guides into the canyon that's later called Zion's Canyon.
If you consider the map of the United States at that time, in 1858, the area north of the Grand Canyon, kind of the Grand Staircase area north of the Grand Canyon, was about the only blank spot left on the map. There had not been any Anglo explorers really check out the whole area north of the Grand Canyon up into Zion Canyon until Nephi Johnson rode his horse up the canyon in 1858.
Which led to Mormon settlements being built around the Virgin River, like Springdale, Rockdale, and Grafton. Nephi Johnson would later become a controversial character for his involvement in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Nephi Johnson recorded in his diary that Paiutes would not go into the canyon at night.
His Paiute guide stopped at the mouth of the canyon and said he wasn't going any further, and so Nephi went up the canyon alone, and then when he came out that evening, his Paiute guide was waiting for him.
The Paiutes shunned Zion Canyon as a place of mysterious happenings, not a good place to be after dark. Many Zion place names come from Paiute theology, including Mount Winnipitz, after Winnipitz, the god of evil, Mount Kinisava, after Kinisava, the trickster, and the Temple of Sinawava. Others believe the Indians did not settle in the canyon because it was not a good area for cultivating crops.
Zion Canyon runs north and south, which means limited sunlight. Now there's a canyon in the south part of Zion known as Perunaweep Canyon, which runs east and west. And if you go into Perunaweep Canyon, you'll find cliff dwellings, rock art, evidence of those ancient ancestral Puebloans, quite a bit. Not so much in Zion Canyon.
I've talked to a couple of Southern Paiutes, in our day, and they say, no, that's not how it was. So you'll get conflicting stories.
Isaac Behunin tells us that the Indians did not like to be in the canyon and refused to be in the canyon at night. Some people have said, well, they thought there were ghosts there, but others would say it was just that they felt that the canyon was spiritually alien to them.
And we had a Paiute elder, and he was talking to a Mormon elder, and the Mormon elder asked him, well, I understand that the Paiutes were afraid to come into the canyon at night. And the Paiute elder said, well, if you had some crazy white man shooting at you, you'd be afraid to come into the canyon too at night. So.
In 1863, Isaac Behunin, along with his wife, Elmina, and their children became the first settlers to build a house within the canyon walls. Behunin was a fiercely devoted Mormon and felt peace living in the canyon.
And he's the one who was credited for first coming up with the name Zion. And he would sit out on his chair, supposedly in the evening, and look up at these massive cliffs and think of this place as Zion, and began to call it that.
Isaac was struck with the beauty of the scenery. It was said that sometimes he would just sit motionless, looking at the mountains and drinking in their beauty. He named the canyon Zion because of the sanctuary and presence of the Almighty he felt there. He said, "A man can worship God among these great cathedrals as well as he can in any man-made church. This is Zion." Their family lived near the present Zion Lodge. The field where the lodge sits now was once filled with corn grown by the Behunins. Isaac's oldest son Elijah recounted an observation he made about the Paiutes who lived near Zion. "I never saw an Indian this side of Springdale. They moved around the country from place to place, usually on foot. They had no horses at first. They camped under rocks and in wickiups." It is not completely clear as to whether Paiutes actually made their homes within the canyon. The fact that the Paru's band of Paiutes who lived in the Virgin River Valley died off or were assimilated into other bands not long after the Mormons settled in the area makes this an especially difficult mystery to uncover. There were differing opinions as to what Zion Canyon should be called among the early Mormon settlers in the area. Isaac Behunin named the canyon Zion because of the place of sanctuary he felt there. But Brigham Young, after journeying to Zion and observing residents of the area participating in what he viewed as aberrations of the faith, proclaimed that the area was not Zion.
Brigham Young decided to send people down to settle this area. So the people that he selected, many of them were from the south of the United States because they knew how to grow the cotton. However, they also knew how to grow tobacco. And so when they came down here, naturally, they not only grew their cotton, which they knew how to do, but they also grew the tobacco. There's particularly quite a bit of it grown over in the Zion Canyon area.
Brigham Young came down and kind of inspected the settlements along the river and in the canyon, and for some reason didn't feel like it should be called Zion. He said, "This is not Zion." And he might have been a little upset because of some of the things that were being grown there, like tobacco and other things. But he said, "This is not Zion." And so for a while, the folks in a comical way started calling the canyon not Zion.
And that's what some settlers called the canyon for about 10 years afterwards, not Zion. If that name had stuck, we'd be known as Not Zion National Park nowadays. Imagine trying to find that on a road map.
In 1916, Methodist minister Frederick Vinning Fisher, along with Mormon Claude Hershey, took a trip through Zion Canyon and named numerous mountains and landmarks inside the canyon.
They made a game out of naming many of the mountains they saw, and a lot of those names stuck.
Many of these names were officially adopted and remain to this day. Frederick remarked, "Never have I seen such a sight before. It is by all odds America's masterpiece. Boys, I have looked for this mountain all my life, but I never expected to find it in this world. This mountain is the Great White Throne."
And those names kind of caught the imaginations of people.
They gave names to other landmarks and mountains, such as the Three Patriarchs, Angel's Landing, East Temple, and the Altar of Sacrifice. Brigham Young called Nephi Johnson to explore the upper Virgin River with orders to find suitable settlement areas along its banks. Johnson had experience as a missionary and Indian interpreter, and in the early fall of 1958, he enlisted the help of local Indians to guide him from Tokerville up to Hurricane Cliffs. Johnson reported back to Brigham Young, informing him of suitable spots for building towns along the river, west of the confluence of the two forks. By December, Johnson gathered a small group of other pioneers and began building a road up the Hurricane Cliffs, which they called Johnson's Twist. Johnson and 5 other men, accompanied by their families, drove their wagons up the cliffs and established the town of Virgin. Within 6 months of the town's creation, a few of the residents expanded into other areas of the valley. Virgin resident Nathan Tenney and 5 other families moved 6 miles up the river, not far from the entrance to Zion Canyon. There they built the town of Grafton along the north banks of the river.
Between 1850 and 1900, the Mormons built 500 villages, and Grafton is one of them.
The original town did not last long, as it was destroyed in a massive flood in January of 1862. The residents rebuilt the settlement a mile further up, on the south side of the river. Expansion outside of Virgin allowed settlers to access more farmland. Although agriculture was a success due to the plentiful water supplies, Grafton proved to be a frustrating place to live. Flooding was common, and the part of the river that flowed near the town was prone to heavy silt deposits, forcing residents to dredge their irrigation canals on an almost weekly basis. In 1904, the Hurricane Canal was finally completed, bringing enough water to create large farming operations in the Hurricane Valley. The completion of the canal rang the death knell for Grafton as many residents moved into the less remote town of Hurricane, once water became plentiful. In 1921, the Mormon Church discontinued its Grafton branch, but a few families remained until 1944, when the entire town was abandoned. Grafton has remained a ghost town ever since. It has been immortalized as a filming location for the classic western Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. In 1997, the remaining buildings were restored and placed on the National Register of Historic Places.
So then the question came, should somebody buy it and turn it into a golf course, or should it remain as a ghost town? And we had to raise $2 million to buy the rest of the town and keep it, and so it's now a National Historic Site. And
Frederick Dellenbaugh accompanied John Wesley Powell on Powell's second expedition to explore the Colorado River and its tributaries from 1871 to 1873. By the time he signed on with Powell at the age of 17, he had already received training as a Romantic-style painter in Munich and Paris. He acted as both artist and assistant typographer in the expedition and was left in awe by the beauties he beheld in what he called Mukuntuweap, the word used by the Paiute to describe Zion Canyon. The exact meaning of Mukuntuweap was not entirely known. 27 years later, he returned on his own with the intent of capturing the grand sights and stunning colors of the area. After returning home with sketches and photographs, he set out to paint the beauty of Zion, which he believed rivaled even Yosemite, Yellowstone, and the Grand Canyon. Dellenbaugh wrote an article in Scribner's Magazine in July 1904.
And he wrote this amazing article about the canyon, and it was illustrated with his photographs. If you think about media in those days, Scribner's Magazine would have been like network news of today. People would subscribe to the magazine by the millions, and that's where they would get their news, through that and many other magazines. The fact that Zion Canyon was talked about in this national publication really opened the eyes of the nation to Zion Canyon. But again, only in black and white.
But he really captured the excitement of the country at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where his paintings were showcased in full display. The colors were so vivid and unique that many people did not believe such a place actually existed.
You know, if you lived east of the Mississippi, where everything is green or gray or blue, all of these reds and oranges and rust and just amazing red rock country, you wouldn't connect with it.
And people said, this is pure, he's dreaming all of this up. There is no such place.
By coincidence, a young Mormon missionary was passing through St. Louis on his way back to southern Utah. This missionary verified the authenticity of Dellenbaugh's portrayals of the canyon.
So he gathered everybody together. I don't know if he got up on a soapbox or not, but he gathered everybody together and he says, listen folks, I just want you to know, these paintings are true depictions of the place. It's a place where I was born. It's a place where I grew up. And they're going, oh no, this isn't, the artist is trying to pull a fast one here.
This initiated a greater interest in the spectacular beauty of southern Utah and propelled Zion into the imaginations of Americans. A young Mormon surveyor named Leo Snow was hired to survey Mukuntuweap Canyon. He became a leading proponent of expanding preservation and access through a federal act designing Mukuntuweap as a national monument.
And the survey that he sent back to Washington included the recommendation that this area should be a national park.
A growing movement to officially recognize the unique natural treasures of the canyon were finally realized when on July 31st, 1909, President Howard Taft signed an executive order creating Mukuntuweap National Monument on the grounds that it was an extraordinary example of canyon erosion and is of the greatest scientific interest, and it appears that the public interest would be promoted by reserving it as a national monument, with such other land as may be necessary for its protection.
When the national monument was declared in 1909, it was the Native American name for the canyon was given to the monument, and that's Mukuntuweap.
Commenting on potential resources among the mountains around Zion, Brigham Young told the father of entrepreneur David Flanagan, "Someday lumber will come off of these canyon walls, flying like a hawk." Due to the scarcity of lumber and how many weeks it took to get from the top of the rock walls, David Flanagan devised cable works in 1900 that lowered lumber into Zion Canyon from Cable Mountain. More than 200,000 board feet of lumber were lowered by 1906. Americans became increasingly mobile as railroads expanded their reach and automobiles made individual mobility available to the masses. Railroad companies and communities along their routes saw potential in promoting tourism to the natural wonders of southern Utah. However, in 1915, the 1,000 visitors to Mukuntuweap National Monument found no hotels or public accommodations nearby. Even the closest railroad stop was too far from the monument for most travelers to make the trip.
There were no roads. You couldn't get to the park. In 1930, Highway 91 came from Salt Lake to Los Angeles.
The Arrowhead Trail, a crude, unpaved road from Los Angeles to Salt Lake, but did not have a branch that led to Zion Canyon. Mukuntuweap soon became a national park and was renamed Zion, ending the long debate of what to call the canyon. On November 19, 1919, the big wooden gate that stretched across the road in the park was closed to the public for the season. This marked the moment when Zion switched from a national monument to a national park.
A National Park Service was very interested in bringing people to the parks, and they saw Union Pacific as a vehicle to do that.
Union Pacific Railroad quickly recognized the potential profits that could be made through promoting tourism and creating ways for travelers to easily access the natural beauties of Utah and Arizonians' canyon country. Union Pacific launched an extensive advertising campaign in popular publications such as Scribner's magazine, promoting tour packages to fit the needs of many visitors. As part of their advertising campaign, Union Pacific also arranged for 5 University of Utah co-eds and an acclaimed dancer from Los Angeles to make a highly publicized tour of Zion just before its official opening as a national park. These attractive young women became the first official visitors to the park.
They realized they needed some images to communicate to the world how cool this was. So what they did is they went to the University of Utah and found 4 or so very attractive young women, young co-eds, and convinced them and a matronly person, an older woman, to come. And they said, you come down to Zion, we'll pay your way, we'll feed you and everything else, and as part of that, we'll take all these photographs as marketing tools. And that's what happened. So before Zion really opened to the public, these young girls came down and they had there's pictures of them shaking hands with William Wiley or riding horses or sitting in the car looking at sights. And they were the first photographs that were used to publicize Zion.
And their faces were plastered across newspapers around the country. One of the women wrote, "One can think only beautiful thoughts amid such splendor." On the morning of May 15, 1920, as their trip drew to a close, these 6 young explorers unlatched the park entrance and without elaborate ceremony, opened the first official tourist season at Zion National Park. The railroads also created a subsidiary business called the Utah Parks Company to make transportation improvements in the area and to take advantage of the tourist opportunity.
Union Pacific came up with a wild idea. Now you got to remember, there are virtually no cars. So people travel largely by rail. And obviously, everybody wants to go to Grand Canyon, but there's no way to get there. But if we can take people on the rail to Cedar City and build a nice hotel there, and then put them on buses driven by gear jammers who were college students, and they would drive them to Cedar Breaks and then to Bryce, but we've got to have a tunnel to get to Zion, so we've got to get the tunnel built in 1930. So then you can get them into Zion, but then how do you get from Zion to Grand? You've got to build a bridge over the Virgin River. And the national parks are not allowed to spend money outside of the national park. And I do not know how it happened, but the national park got the money to build the bridge.
These enhancements included laying railroad track to Cedar City, Utah, building a railway station, constructing lodges that provided food at each park, and establishing a bus service that drove visitors along the entire Grand Circle.
I mean, the first set of what they call buses were really just glorified touring cars. If you went on the Grand Circle tour, you'd start at Zion, spend a couple nights at Zion. They would take you then to the North Rim of the Grand Canyon, to Bryce Canyon, and up to Cedar Breaks, and back down to Cedar City to take the train home. It became very successful not only for this community, but it brought a lot of people into this area.
They were looking to sell tickets to their trains, and towards that end they started building lodges throughout the West in national parks. And they built the original Zion Lodge here in the 1920s. They would bring people on train to Cedar City, and then they would bus them into Zion National Park to stay at the lodge.
The Utah Parks Company was almost exclusively run by college students. Back in those days, you could earn your entire tuition in a summer working at the park. So one thing they prided themselves on was creating this all-inclusive experience. So from the moment you stepped off the train to the moment you got back on the train, you were almost exclusively in the hands of college students. They would bring in students from all over to come in and do this. And what was exciting about the Parks Company at Zion and Bryce and the North Rim is that they also provided entertainment. So the most important line on the Utah Parks Company application wasn't, you know, how much you want to make or, you know, do you have a criminal background? It really was about what can you do? What talent do you have? So what would happen is that everyone understood that once the sun went down, there was really not much to do other than look at the stars. So you would have dinner, they would have a ranger lecture, and then about 8 o'clock they would have an employee show.
As the 20th century progressed, railroad passenger traffic was replaced by automobile travel, and Union Pacific's interest in supporting national park tourism declined as a result. In 1960, passenger trains ceased traveling to Cedar City, and in 1972, Union Pacific donated its concession-related infrastructure to the National Park Service.
The Parks Company lasted until 1973, 50 years almost exactly, and of course, like everything else, it died because of the car. The Union Pacific really wanted more traffic, more ease for their buses to get in, and once we built roads and people came back from World War II, they began driving everywhere, and passenger trains stopped all over.
The facilities at Cedar Breaks were demolished, as were some of the developments at Bryce and Zion.
And the citizens of Cedar City just rose up. I mean, they were very upset, and we know now that both the Zion Lodge and the Bryce Lodge were on the list to be demolished. But it was because of the outcry of the people of Cedar City that lodge is saved. And now it's looked at as a great benefit to the park. I know the superintendent at Cedar Breaks would love to have the Cedar Breaks Lodge there. So it's important to note that the tourists that drove this really expanded the park and really gave them the resources to be successful.
But the lodge at Zion remains in use today. In 1776, two Catholic fathers, Francisco Dominguez and Sylvester Escalante, led an expedition through the area that would eventually be known as Kolob Canyons. Later in 1826, trapper and trader Jedediah Smith explored some of the downstream areas of Kolob under contract with the American Fur Company. Kolob is less visited than the more developed portions of Zion National Park. Located off of Interstate 15 northwest of the main park, Kolob Canyons were officially added to Zion in 1956. The canyon is home to the second largest freestanding arch in the world, and according to geologists, it will probably outlast the slightly longer yet very fragile landscape arch located near Moab, Utah. The highest elevation in Zion, at Horse Ranch Mountain, lies within Kolob. Kolob is a uniquely Mormon term that signifies a heavenly place that is close to the throne of God. In 1930, Arthur Fife, a geologist and city engineer, took his friend Gus Larson to Kolob in order to explore and conduct some surveys in hope of homesteading in the area.
Fife and Larson went up exploring that area and doing a little surveying, and they decided to do some homesteading up there. The land had been grazed with cattle for a while, so, a lot of foliage had been taken down, but there's nobody really living up there, and the land was basically free for homesteading.
The two found the land they favored in 1930. There they built two cabins, and in 1932 and 33 they erected fences around the land that they had staked for their homesteads. Larson invested the most time into developing his claim.
Gus kept going up to his until 1936, when he was called as the mission president over in Sweden. And so he put his cabin on hold and went over to Sweden for 3 years. They eventually had to come back because of the outbreak of World War II and the Germans moving into Sweden. And so he came back in 1939. Well, it turns out in the meantime, the government had decided to annex that part of the country, close it for homesteading, and turn it into a national monument, which eventually became part of a national park. When Gus went back, he tried to reclaim his cabin and his land, and he found that he had not lived on it for long enough to actually get clear title to it.
When he returned to his cabin in 1939, he found that it had been claimed as a part of the new Kowab National Monument, established in 1937. He disputed the seizure of his land, but his petition was denied on the grounds that he had not lived there long enough to qualify as a homesteader. The sheer rock walls at Zion did not allow the Native Americans or early white settlers to migrate seasonally to higher and lower altitudes for their livestock. When the park opened, lobbyists explained to Congress that the park needed to be accessible by everyone.
There was a need to somehow be able to get out of the canyon onto the east side and to connect Bryce Canyon National Park and the north rim of the Grand Canyon.
There was at least one trail built by Native Americans that was still visible and used mostly for livestock. Over the years, at least one Paiute Indian and several cattle have fallen to their death off the steep trail. Following the route of the previous trail, the Park Service widened and paved the switchbacks, creating a road from the main highway to the future entrance of the tunnel.
They had a real tough time building it, but they were under real pressure to get it built.
It's hard to even imagine doing it today. They did that in the late 1920s with little more than picks and shovels and obviously dynamite. It took a lot of dynamite to do it.
St. George in southern Utah was very isolated. There was no people coming through down here. And so the gene pool was somewhat limited. We were starting to get genetic inbreeding problems that were showing up. And one of the advantages when they came down and made the tunnel, they brought workers down, which mixed with the population here. And also it brought people into the area so that we got new people being infused into the area.
Tunnel boss Richard Scott oversaw the whole project. The tunnel was to be 1.1 miles long, and due to lack of ventilation, it was decided that 6 window galleries needed to be cut through the tunnel. The crew built 100-foot scaffoldings against the towering rock walls to access the tunnel through the windows. The daily dynamite blasts could be heard echoing through the canyon.
And all of a sudden there would be a big boom and, and a big blast in the tunnel. And
after workers began to blow up dynamite, the workers at the camp below the cliffs would run and press themselves against the towering rock walls to shield themselves from falling rocks. They did this because earlier in their stay, a 10-pound chunk of sandstone came crashing down through their roof and onto their dinner table, prompting precautions from then on. Only 2 fatalities occurred during the 3-year construction project. A rock slide caused a boulder to come loose and crush Mac McLean. The other death was Johnny Morrison, a veteran miner from Canada who lost his life inhaling too much sand and dynamite fumes while in the tunnel. An enormous ring drill was sent through the tunnel to widen and smooth the tunnel out. The rubble from the drilling was taken down to the switchbacks and placed where fill was needed. It had only taken the crew 313 days to drill through the mountain. Additional dynamite blasting and drilling to even the tunnel's diameter enough to accommodate cars took until July 10, 1930. At the dedication on July 4, 1930, all 48 governors of the United States traveled down to the Mount Carmel Tunnel dedication. Thousands of people attended the celebration, which featured speakers and an opening prayer by Latter-day Saint President Heber J. Grant. The tunnel remains a work of engineering marvel, and for years was the longest tunnel in the United States of its type. The tunnel gained a spot on the National Register of Historic Places, and later as a historic civil engineering landmark by the American Society of Civil Engineers.
In fact, if you drive through the tunnel these days, you'll see the big galleries, and you'll drive by one gallery that's kind of like a wall, and there's just 2 little windows on top. That was from that big rock fall.
In another 100 years, assuming that erosion will continue, the tunnel is going to become unusable. And they're going to have to decide, what to do at that point.
probably fighting an uphill battle due to the nature of the Navajo sandstone.
The Great Depression hit the economy hard, bringing unemployment nationwide to 25%. Many people struggled to survive until the New Deal was implemented in 1933, bringing changes to the nation and Zion National Park. Among President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs, there was a plan to preserve and improve public lands. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created to put young, unemployed men to work on public lands and to provide them with skills needed for future employment. The CCC contributed much to the park, and if not for their service, many dozens of trails would not have been established.
Canyon Overlook, the Watchman Trail, Riverside Walk, the West Rim Trail, which now leads up to Angel's Landing, was all done by the Civilian Conservation Corps.
For 9 years, they built and improved trails, fought wildfires, built campgrounds, parking areas and buildings, and constructed flood control installations along the river.
Because they also built flood control. If you walk along the banks of the Virgin River up by the area of Zion Lodge, you'll see revetments on the banks of the river, which are basically iron mesh that are holding stones in place. Basically, those revetments stop the river from overflowing its banks during flash flood events. So that was one thing that they did. It would have unintended consequences. A lot of the cottonwood trees that we have there are old, mature cottonwood trees. You don't see a lot of young ones. And when you stop the river from overflowing its banks, you stop the creation of fresh sandbars. Those cottonwood trees need those fresh sandbars in which to germinate. In the springtime, they release this white fibrous material into the air, flies through the air looking for fresh sandbars. But again, they're not there because of that work that the CCC did in the 1930s. So certainly lots of good things they did, and also some unintended consequences from their work.
Zion has been the center of many exciting stories and legends. One such tale originated in Kanab, Utah, a small town not far from the park. In 1914, a man named Freddie Crystal claimed to have a map showing the location of buried Aztec gold. The accompanying myth tells that as the Spanish tightened their stranglehold on the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, Emperor Moctezuma II made a final desperate attempt to save his people's wealth. The story alleges that 2,000 Aztec warriors were dispatched carrying the last of the empire's gold with instructions to hide it in the labyrinth of canyons to the north. Crystal believed his map indicated that the treasure was buried somewhere in or around Zion National Park. It wasn't long until both locals and visitors began scouring the landscape. Although no gold has ever materialized, the story remains a favorite among locals. A 1996 film attempts to bank on the legend surrounding the hidden treasure. Zion Canyon, Treasure of the Gods, was made to be shown in the privately owned Zion Canyon IMAX theater located just outside the park. Treasure of the Gods was directed by talented filmmaker Keith Merrill, who also created films about the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone. The film is an impressive visual presentation showing spectacular panoramas of the canyon. It has also inspired many visitors to explore Zion in depth by leaving their cars and walking around the remote areas that cannot be seen by an automobile. Many of the events shown in the film contain historical facts, but the creators chose to exercise a bit of artistic license as well. The film ties Native American history to later events by telling a story about two white men who were exploring Zion in the early 20th century. While photographing remote parts of the canyon, they stumbled upon the ancient Aztec treasure, but were suddenly swept up in a flash flood. Barely escaping with their lives, they were unable to relocate the treasure. Although Treasure of the Gods continues to be shown in the Zion Canyon Theater, many historians and employees of the park have taken issue with the film. They believe it presents an untrue history by putting exciting legends above true events. The film also uses several scenes that were filmed in Bryce National Park, and therefore does not even present a true portrayal of the visual wonders of Zion.
It may not tell the Zion story perfectly, but you got to see the film. It's a great thing. The Park Service had a real tough time with it, and they never did like it.
The format was great, the big screen, the format. I loved some of the photography there. They did take a little bit of liberty with Zion's history. There was never any gold here or treasures. There was never any Spanish enslavement of Native Americans here. One thing that drives our park managers in that film is they show a family walking on the east side with a dog unleashed. That's one thing that we try to keep to a minimum.
One of the things that I noticed in watching it, and then as I did a little research on it after, was that very little of it was filmed in Zion. The vast majority was filmed over in Bryce and other areas.
My concerns with the film are more just the way that the artistic license was used to kind of pull different stories together into Zion.
Back in the early days of the park, visitors had to hike or ride horse-drawn carriages on dirt paths for hours to see the sights. Later, they had to pay for bus tours from Union Pacific. Now visitors either drive their own vehicles from their homes or fly into St. George and other close airports where they rent transportation to drive to Zion. During peak season, private automobiles are not allowed in the park, but a free bus shuttles visitors efficiently from Springdale into Zion. The decrease in traffic created by automobile restrictions enhances the experience of the park and prevents long lines of traffic that would otherwise overrun the pristine area. Zion National Park has caught the imagination of so many generations.
And what was interesting about Zion specifically is that at Bryce Canyon you look down, at the Grand Canyon you look down, at Cedar Breaks you look down, but really mostly Zion is experienced by looking up.
As the great environmentalist Edward Abbey proclaimed, wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit, and as vital to our lives as water and good bread. Zion can be our sanctuary. Zion is Utah's oldest and most popular national park, hosting almost 3 million visitors a year. These numerous guests, many from outside the United States, come to experience the vibrant colors and breathtaking sceneries contained in the desert oasis of Zion. Zion offers many spectacular hikes and scenic drives. Among the favorites are the Narrows, where visitors get to stomp through water for hours while taking in the spectacular views. At times, the slot canyons become so tight, hikers can almost touch both walls at the same time. Angel's Landing is a breathtaking hike up a narrow trail and across a rock fin. The last half mile of the hike has 1,500-foot cliffs on both sides. The subway requires a full day's journey to reach a picturesque slot canyon. The subway receives its name from the rounded rock overhangs that were carved by water and encompass parts of the trail. These eroded rock walls create the appearance of an underground subway tunnel that is so perfect it could have been cut by a machine. The 1.1-mile-long Carmel Tunnel that connects the northern and southern parts of the park is a favorite drive among tourists. It was the longest tunnel ever constructed at its completion in 1930. The Kolob Arch is the second longest natural arch in the world, only 3 feet shorter than the longest at Arches National Park. Whether by foot, bicycle, or automobile, Zion National Park has something to entice the eye and spark the wonder of millions of people per year. Zion is a Hebrew word that denotes a place of sanctuary. The name was given to the area by the early Mormon pioneers that saw the presence of the Almighty in the middle of a harsh desert landscape. Zion National Park is located in southwestern Utah between the small towns of Springdale and Kanab. The park sits on the edge of the Colorado Plateau and is part of a supersequence rock formation known as the Grand Staircase. This vast slab of sedimentary rock stretches from Bryce Canyon National Park in the north, then descends 5,000 feet over 100 miles to the south before ending at the base of the Grand Canyon.
Grand Canyon's at the bottom, Zion's at the middle, Bryce is up at the top.
Over millions of years, various ecosystems, including inland seas, sand dunes, and riverbeds, left sedimentary deposits of diverse colors and thickness.
There was a big sand desert here 180 million years ago. Geologists call it the Navajo Desert. And the sand dunes that existed in the Great Navajo Desert were between 2,000 and 3,000 feet in depth. Some of the largest sand dunes the world has ever seen, right here 180 million years ago.
9 distinct layers can be seen in the park. Underground tectonic processes shifted and warped the formations, slowly creating different variations.
Well, time marches on. You got all that compression pushing all that sand together, turning it into stone.
What we now call the Virgin River began to carve what is now Zion Canyon. And those sand dunes solidified into sandstone.
And make no mistake about it, gravity and water are literally tearing these cemented sand dunes apart.
The majestic beauty of Zion Canyon is the result of the Virgin River cutting and weaving its way through the many layers of the Grand Staircase.
The Virgin River is removing about 16 tons of rock and dirt every day out of the canyon. Now that's on average. Most of that material is moved during 10 to 15 flash flood events a year.
Zion's breathtaking sights are the work of millions of years of powerful geologic forces that continue to act today, such as a 5.8 magnitude earthquake that struck the park in 1992.
A slide came down, dammed up the Virgin River, a lake formed, and eventually so much water built up that the river cut around the landslide along the path of least resistance, which turned out to be the scenic drive. We lost about 300 feet of road in a matter of minutes, and it stranded people at Zion Lodge for about 3 days.
Despite their sturdy appearance, the beautiful rock structures of Zion are a part of a dynamic landscape that is under slow but constant change.
But there's going to be more slides. The road's probably going to be taken out again and again and again.
2 ancient groups of inhabitants occupied the lands in and around Zion Canyon before Europeans ever made it into the region. The ancient Pueblo people, known as the Anasazi, a name given to them by the Navajo, meaning enemy, emerged in the southwest United States around 300 BC. Archaeological evidence shows that the Anasazi were quite sophisticated. They cultivated maize, beans, and squash, while supplementing their diet with protein sources through hunting. They lived in complex and carefully crafted structures such as pit houses, pueblos, and cliff dwellings. By 1300 AD, the Anasazi had mysteriously disappeared.
There's a transition from Anasazi, which has existed maybe 1,000 years before that, to Fremont, which is more pit houses.
Stories explaining their disappearance have been the topic of much speculation, including claims that they traveled south and became the mighty Aztec people of Mexico, to more believable theories that they assimilated into modern-day Pueblo tribes.
It's difficult to know whether one group replaces the other or intermixes and assimilates with the other.
The Fremont people lived throughout Utah and in parts of Colorado, Idaho, and Nevada. Arriving later than the Anasazi, around 700 AD, they often occupied the same regions. Due to their close proximity, these 2 cultures were long believed to be the same, but archaeological findings confirm distinct differences from the